Hey guys, this is John, and I'm coming direct again from London in old-timey radio quality. You guys are probably used to it by now, but I don't have my microphone here like I've said, so apologies for the audio that I've had these past few videos. Hope it's bearable. Alright, so in this round, I played an international master from India, Mishra Swayams, rated 2477. This is the first time in the tournament that I've been paired up in rating. All three of my previous opponents have been lower rated than me, but I'm sitting on 3 out of 3 going into this game, feeling good, feel like I'm playing well. So we got our first real test. And this player is a young player. He has 2 GM norms, and his FIDE rating has been above 2,500 before, he told me. So I would suspect it's only a matter of time before this guy becomes a grandmaster. So he opened with D4. I played D5. He played C4. I played C6. So already I've had 3 Slavs this tournament out of 4 rounds. Knight F3, Knight F6, Knight C3. And I have both the Slav and the semi-Slav in my repertoire. And I decided to take on C4, so entering the Slav. And just to remind you, the semi-Slav, if you don't know, is E6. It's a bit different from the Slav. In the Slav, black is not taking on C4 in hopes of hanging onto this pawn. It's more so we're taking to force white to lose a couple tempos and regaining the pawn so that black can smoothly complete their development. So my plan is bishop out to F5 and pawn to E6 if allowed. So for instance, if white plays E3, trying to attack the pawn on C4, we could actually play B5 and defend it. And that is why the main line for white is the move that Swayams played, which is A4. It's a prophylactic move. White is trying to stop black from playing B5. And that's why you see this move in this line. Otherwise, A4 is not a very positionally desirable move for white because it does weaken the B3 and the B4 squares. But it's kind of necessary. White has to take a timeout to stop the B5 threat. And this is the window that black needs to try to complete their development. So hence I played bishop F5. Now here there's 2 main moves. There's E3 and there's the move that my opponent played, which was knight E5. So white moves the knight again, but they hope to recapture the pawn with the knight and possibly play F3 and E4, building up a big pawn center. In the lines with E3, white has a more modest center with pawns here and here, and I think black has good chances to equalize in this line, although there are thousands of games you can find in the database from here. In my opinion, knight E5 is a little more critical than E3. So after knight E5, I played knight BD7. Again, I'm not hoping to hold on to this pawn. I'm going to let white take it and just content myself with smooth development. White did take the pawn, and here I played queen C7. Knight B6 is another popular move at the moment, trying to challenge the knight on C4, but queen C7 was part of my preparation for this game, so I played it. With queen C7, I'm looking to play E5 and take a stab at that pawn on D4, try to fight back in the middle of the board. This also opens up castling queenside, so black could look to put the king on that wing in the future. White played G3. I played E5 as planned. White took the pawn on E5. I recaptured. Bishop F4. This pins the knight to the queen. Should I move this knight now, I would lose that queen on C7. So I have to defend the knight, and I played knight FD7. Bishop out to G2. And now pawn F6. So this is a very classical position, even going back to some of the old world championship matches featuring like Alekhine, for instance. You could find examples of this opening in this position. And F6 is the traditional move, so defending the knight a little bit better. And there's also the move G5, which is sometimes called Morozevich's line. It's a specialty of Grandmaster Alexander Morozevich. And black can actually get away with G5 because note that bishop takes G5 would just lose the knight on C4. So whereas F6 seeks to defend the knight reliably on E5, G5 is more active, and there's not a real consensus at the moment, in my opinion, whether F6 or G5 is the best move, but if you play this line for white or black, both of these moves should be on your radar. So I went with the normal continuation, and my opponent castled. And here I played G5. So previously, black has played knight C5 here in quite a few games, but according to the theory I've seen and the games that I've studied, black doesn't quite equalize with this move. And I won't get into why, because that would require a protracted analysis. But basically, knight c5 has been kind of overtaken by this g5 move now. So now that it's been even prepared a bit, the pawn on f6 helps out in defending the knight and also defending the pawn. And black can take a stab at that bishop because black really does not want to have to deal with this pin in the long run. So it's better to try to clarify that bishop's intentions. Force white to do that. And this is all part of my prep, so I was not using much time at this point. I should mention that my opponent did come a little bit late. I feel like I've already mentioned the lateness of my opponents in the past few rounds. This guy came about 10 minutes late, so no big deal. But I thought I would say that because that does play into the time situation later. So he took on e5 here with the bishop. It's also possible to take on e5 with the knight. That's another line. And after knight takes e5, black should play g takes f4, and then knight takes d7, queen takes d7 is a line. And black can even go down a pawn in this line, but still have good compensation for it. So my opponent took with the bishop. I recaptured with my knight. And here he took on e5. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect when we got to this position. I was actually pretty sure I'd get this position if I wanted it out of this opening, because he's played this before, and when you're preparing for a game, especially against a good player, you can pull up the games that they previously played and take a look at what they've done in certain positions, and you really encounter players of all types. Like, some players will stick to their guns and pretty much play the same line all the time. More so now, especially with good players, you see people who mix it up and they're aware of what they've played previously, and I think more often you don't see people sticking to the same line over and over again. As far as predictability goes, this guy was a little on the predictable side. He tended to not deviate too much from his set openings. Not like he was playing exactly the same way each game, but he clearly prefers certain lines, so that helps in the preparation. So we got this position. He took on e5. Knight e3 is played as well, so dropping the knight back to attack the bishop on f5. But he was content to swap. Knight took with the queen. So we can take a moment to talk about this position because there have been some exchanges. So black has the pair of bishops, but I'm a little bit behind in development. You notice my king is still in the center. And also I've weakened myself with f6 and g5. Not that f6 and g5 are terrible moves. At the time that I played them on move, 11 and 12, they made sense and they were the theoretically approved moves. But these do represent weaknesses now. You can see that, like, this diagonal stretching from a2 to g8 is open. So if white were to pop their queen out to b3, which he does very soon, I might experience problems castling short. I might never be able to castle short, actually. Also, I have to watch that white doesn't try to rush with the e and the f pawns and open the middle of the board and try to take advantage again of my king position. So the long-term factors, I think, are okay for black. Like, the bishop pair is nice, and also my pawn structure on the queen side is not bad. I do have a 3 versus 2, and it's probably okay to start thinking about scenarios where that could matter. But black has to get out of the opening still, and white has a little bit of an initiative here. Much of the game will depend on whether I can consolidate my position. So my opponent played a5 here. This introduces the annoying a6 lever, so trying to weaken the c6 pawn. You see that bishop on g2 is lurking, and it really wants a chance to take on c6. So I had seen all this before. I was slowing down a little bit, trying to remember what to do, but I was fairly certain that I had this move in my preparation, so I didn't pause to think too long. a6 seems very obvious, and I think it's best. Just put a stop to the pawn advancing. We create a weakness on b6, but I'm not that worried about knight a4 to b6. I could always just move my rook over in that case, and that's also a time-consuming maneuver for white. So here Swayams did play queen b3. A good move. It attacks b3, and also the queen has influence on this diagonal, as we've discussed. Now we're following some games. There's been a few games that have been previously reached here, and I think in almost every one of them, black has played the move I did, which was rook to b8, defending the pawn on b7 reliably. But the engine says it's actually possible to castle queenside if black wants. Now, this is a pretty gutsy move to make, although it's not uncommon in this line to do this. You might castle queenside even though you're facing the onslaught of the fianchettoed light bishop, and white has resources on this side of the board. Even knowing that the computer likes it, I still don't think I would go for this. Rook b8 just seems a lot safer to me, and I would just fear like simple stuff if I were to castle queenside, like rook fc1 and knight a4, but black does have resources in reply. After the game, Swayams even mentioned that bishop takes c6 could be played, although the engine doesn't like it. He talked about this line, and he said that even in the case of something like this, giving up the bishop for 2 pawns, he thought this could be unpleasant for black to defend. But this was all moot because I played that rook b8 move. And now he played a creative rook lift, rook a4. So activating the rook up the a file. And the idea of this move, I think, is twofold. One, it sort of creates threats involving rook e4. Like, I have to watch where my light square bishop goes, because rook e4 is always hanging in the air, pitting my queen to my king. And also, it allows him to play f4 with more force. So if ever he wants to play pawn f4, attacking my queen and also the pawn on g5, and attempt to open lines via offering a pawn exchange, that rook on a4 is going to provide a little more oomph behind that push. And he may even capture on f4 with the rook, should I take with my g-pawn. So it's actually kind of hard to find better ideas for white. In the game, I had a feeling he would play rook a4. Also, it's good to keep the rook on the a-file because he does keep the pawn on a5 defended for the moment. So after rook a4, I played bishop to e6. Even though I just mentioned that I have to be careful about moving this bishop, bishop e6 comes with tempo on the queen. And I wanted to play pawn f5. I thought that playing pawn f5 would allow me to reliably protect the e4 square, and also it would allow for bishop g7 and castling. That's not to say I couldn't play bishop g7 here. It's not the greatest move, but I'd much rather have the pawn up on f5 and have an open diagonal for my dark square bishop. So I thought bishop e6 fit the bill. And I thought I had remembered a game where black had done something very similar, either in this position or one almost identical to it. So bishop e6 was not a tough decision. Oh, and by the way, note that bishop takes c6 check after rook b8 never works for white. Some of you may have been drawn to that move. Black can just take the bishop, and my queen on e5 defends the rook, so white cannot play queen takes b8. So after bishop e6, white dropped the queen back, queen to c2. And here I played f5 as planned. And now, this is where we deviate from what has previously happened. And there was a game between Denis Shmailov and Pascal Charbonneau from the U.S. Chess League. I wasn't aware of this game, but it had reached this position in this year, actually, just I think a month or two ago. And in that game, white played e3, which strikes me as a bit slow. And black was able to play bishop g7 and then castle comfortably, and eventually Grandmaster Charbonneau, playing black, won this game. So I think the move my opponent played is more critical than e3. It seems like he might want to play f4 straight away, but if f4 is played, I can take. And should white take with a pawn, for instance, I think queen c5 check is nice for black, forcing white to do something with the king. So let's say king h1. Now, because the knight on c3 is pinned, and also I'm still controlling e4, I think black could even just play bishop g7 and prepare castling. And the fact that my king is still in the center past move 20 now isn't significant, because white's not incredibly well coordinated, and they're not ripping open my king instantly. So I wasn't worried about the immediate f4. And I think the move that white played is better. Also, if the immediate f4 and I take and he takes with the a rook, then I could play bishop to h6. I might not even put my bishop on g7. I might just put it all the way out here, attack that rook, and after the rook moves, I've bought time to castle once again. So I actually like the move that he played. King h1 seems like a good idea. A good prophylactic move. And here I played bishop g7. I think it's also possible for black to consider playing like bishop e7 or bishop c5 roundabout here. But bishop g7 seemed like the best diagonal, so I just went with that. I like the long-term pressure on b2. This could limit the movements of the white knight on c3, since b2 will always be attacked by my queen and bishop in that case. And here, white continued with f4. I took the pawn, and he took with the rook. So I kind of saw what white was up to with this. He's abandoning his a pawn, but he is introducing an all-out effort to win the f5 pawn. He's not currently threatening to take it, unless he's willing to sacrifice the exchange, but his plan is to play bishop h3, and then he'll have 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on that pawn. I think taking the pawn on a5 is dangerous for black, extremely dangerous at the moment. I could be faced with a move like e4 in that case. White might try to even sacrifice a pawn to prevent me from castling. And something like f takes e4, rook takes e4 is unthinkable for black. My king is just going to die in the middle of the board. And I'm pinned here, and I could probably resign in a matter of moves. So after rook a takes f4, even though the a5 pawn is hanging, I must get my king to safety. So I castled. And now my opponent played bishop h3. All right, so I haven't asked you guys any questions on this game yet, mainly because this has all been pretty theoretical so far. But this is an interesting training exercise. And this is a little harder than some of the previous quiz questions I've given you. Here I'm not going to ask you to find the best move at all. I just want you to come up with some candidate moves. In other words, what are some moves that you would think about for black? I would suggest looking for something like 2 to 3 moves. And let's see how your moves match up with what I thought about the game. And you can pause your video if you like. Okay, so there will often be a time in a game where you face a critical decision. And when you have a critical decision, almost by definition, your play is not forced. That is, you won't have just one clearly good path or only path to follow. You're probably going to have a few different moves to consider. And that's why in games between good players, you can often boil down the games to what happened at certain key moments. A lot of the times the moves leading up to them might even be trivial, but two good players could look at a game independently and say, this is a key moment. There's a few moves to consider here. We got to find the best one. So the 3 main moves I thought about in this position are queen takes a5, bishop d5 check, and rook be8. And I'll say that one of those moves is not the best, whereas 2 of them, you can kind of go either way. So 2 of the 3 moves are acceptable for black, and I think one of those 2 should be played, whereas one of the 3, I'm glad I rejected. And let's start with that one. Bishop d5 check is a move I thought about, because white has just abandoned this diagonal, so it kind of makes sense to check them, and maybe even try to get their knight to take, because I think if king g1, then queen to e3 check looks pretty good, possibly with black's bishop even coming in here. The thing I didn't like, though, is that after bishop d5 check, knight takes d5, queen takes d5 check, white can play rook 1 to f3. And when you're trying to evaluate positions with bishops of opposite color, especially middle game positions, if I could just highlight the opposing bishops here, it often boils down to king safety. And the side that has the safer king, the side that has more of a free hand in attacking the exposed king of the opponents, they're typically going to have the advantage. And that's the scenario I saw here. I thought black's king, my king, was pretty shaky, whereas his was nicely tucked away. And yes, I can probably go win the a5 pawn, but he's about to win f5. He has 2 pawns on the king side to cover his king, whereas I only had that h pawn. And I saw myself getting very weak on the light squares. And indeed, the computer confirms this is dangerous for black. So I think it's a viable candidate move. You'd want to spend a little time looking at it, but bishop d5 should not be played. I'd say queen takes a5 is the obvious move. You may figure, like, why not take this pawn, because we're probably going to lose f5 anyways. Let's just grab white's a pawn so that it's even material when he captures there. And this line is fine. So if you chose queen takes a5, this is like your top candidate move, that's totally fine. The only thing I didn't like about it is that after bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, we swap rooks. Again, I was worried about my king. The engine says this is basically equal, but I didn't like the fact that white was attacking my queen, and should I play, let's say, queen to b4, the move rook h5 kind of concerned me, attacking the pawn on h7. I would have to play h6 here to avoid the queen takes h7 threat, and then I calculated queen g6, and here I even saw that it was possible to play queen takes b2, and despite black only having basically the bishop on g7 for support, the point is that if white takes on h6, I have this nice idea queen c1 check, forking the king and the rook, and my queen will come back and take that rook, and I'll be winning. So I saw that line, but something about this entire variation just didn't appeal to me. I thought I was going out of my way to keep strict material equality, and possibly I'd be missing something, and my king would be suffering the consequences soon. So this is like a scenario where even though my calculations were fine, my instincts about the position, like something about it just didn't appeal to me. So I decided to err on the side of caution and not take the pawn on a5 and keep my queen closer to the action. So I played this move rook be8. I think this is the most interesting of the three moves. The engine doesn't like it. Well, the engine thinks it's acceptable, but it definitely prefers queen a5. It thinks queen takes a5 is much more clear cut. But from a human point of view, the more I've looked at this move and having played this game and analyzed this, I think it's pretty tough for white to prove something after this move. And I keep everything safe, and I still retain the option of taking the pawn. Now, we are allowing white to capture on f5. And now after I take, which is forced, rook takes, and now rook takes. Note that if white takes with the queen, that plays into my hands because I can swap queens here and then take the knight on c3. And if ever this happens, I can grab the pawn on e2, and we have a extremely drawish rook endgame. It's rook and 4 pawns versus rook and 4. Yes, the pawn structure is a little bit different for both sides, but this is virtually a guaranteed draw. And this is basically my point with this rook be8 move. I'm offering a pawn, but in doing so, I keep all of the perks of my position. And at all times, I'm threatening to take that knight on c3, as you'll see coming up. So after rook takes f5, I played the retreat move queen e6. So I'm uncovering the bishop, threatening to take the knight on c3, and that pawn on e2 is a liability for white. I might just go grab it in a lot of lines. So I guess you could categorize this as a positional pawn sacrifice, whereby I'm somewhat forfeiting a chance to win, but I have a lot of ways I can try to make a draw from here. And given that my opponent's a little bit higher rated and he's been playing well thus far, and I really haven't had that many chances, I thought a draw was an acceptable result from this position. It's kind of how it goes in these tournaments sometimes. Like, as black, you're pretty satisfied with a draw against a good player, especially if they're playing a theoretical line, you're playing a theoretical line, and the game is trending towards that result. So yeah, after queen e6, bishop takes c3 is a threat. The rook on f5 is a little bit loose. The queen is kind of having to babysit multiple points. The knight, the pawn on e2, and also the rook. And yeah, I can't find too much for white here. There's some moves that could be tried, like let's say rook f2, trying to better defend the pawn on e2. But if ever rook f2 is played, I can play bishop d4 and harass that rook. And something like rook g2 could in fact be dangerous for white after, say, a reply like queen f6, threatening queen f1. So white might have to put his pieces on truly awkward squares if he wants to try to milk this position for anything. And in doing so, he may even lose the game. Like, I might wake up and decide to play for a win if he goes to great lengths to get the full point. So he played in this position rook h5, threatening the pawn on h7. And here I played queen g6. This offers a queen trade, but it's kind of paradoxical about this position, once again, is that I don't mind certain trades. Like if the queens come off the board here, queen takes g6, h takes g6, I'm on his rook. So let's say rook g5, and then I'll just come up and defend the pawn. And again, I can try to eliminate the knight and go after that pawn on e2. Note that his king is very far away. It can't come over to support that pawn. If his king was on g1 and he was able to play like king f1 here, this might be a different story, but he's one square too far away, and this is going to allow me to completely equalize the game. So I can bother him with trades. A lot of times when you're defending, trading is a good method to try to reduce your opponent's attacking chances, and I think this position is no exception, even though I'm down a pawn. So queen g6, the trade is fine for me, and I'm attacking his queen and also the rook. The only way he can avoid a trade is to either play rook back to f5, which I don't even think is that good, because I can probably play bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, rook takes e2 here. It's the same story. Or the move that he played in the game. So he actually played queen b3 check. Okay, next question, and this will be the final question for this game. What should black play in response to queen b3 check? Here you do have to find the best move. So, consider your candidate moves, but try to figure out which move is best. And you can pause your video if you like. All right, so finding the following move is what secured the draw for me in this game. Because if I get this move wrong, I'm probably going to be suffering, and I may not have compensation for that pawn that I've sacrificed. Now, in full disclosure, I wasn't sure about this move prior to entering this entire line. I thought it might be possible, but I had to recalculate it once I got here. I actually spent a lot of time looking at king h8, but after king h8, white can just play rook h4. And yes, his forces are a little bit scattered, but the problem with my king on h8 is that should I ever take that knight, he can always recapture with check. That's one issue I have, is that my king is pretty exposed too. So if ever this bishop takes c3 idea is going to work, I probably can't be playing it when he can recapture with check. That really slows me down. So king h8 is not so good. Queen f7, offering a trade. Probably we should reject that because of white taking on h7 at the end, and now they've won a pawn and they're up 2 pawns. Note that I can't even play bishop takes g7 right now. Or sorry, bishop takes c3. I'd have to play king g6 or king g8 first, but still I don't like having to fight against the g and h pawns. So the best move is queen to e6, offering a trade once again. And we've already established that a queen trade could just be fine for black, and this position's no exception. This is very similar to if the trade took place on g6. Should white capture on e6, I'm still threatening the knight and taking here. Rook g5 pitting my bishop would only slow me down temporarily. King f7, and I still have the threat. To play queen e6 in full confidence, though, you have to calculate queen takes b7, because this is the move that presumably white would like to continue with. The idea of queen takes b7, aside from winning another pawn, is that bishop takes c3 is prevented, because queen takes h7 would be the reply. And then after king f8, white could just recapture. And white's king is open, but it's not as open as black's king, is my problem here. Note that e4 and d5, both of those squares are covered, once by the white queen and also by the white rook here. So there's not going to be a perpetual check. That could be a saving grace for black in a lot of lines, but definitely not here. I think white's just winning. So in seeing this and allowing queen e6, queen takes b7, you'd have to foresee that black has the lovely move h6 here. So pawn to h6. And it took me a while to find this, and I think by the time that I played queen e6 right here, so after queen b3 check, so this move, we're on move 27, I had no more than 10 to 15 minutes left. I had to burn up a lot of time to find this. Played the opening pretty fast, but once I was looking at having to give up a pawn, I really slowed down to try to find the best move, and I'm glad I did, because this was time well spent here. And going back to that position, if queen takes b7, h6, this is suddenly pretty bad for white, because the threat of queen takes h7 has just been disarmed. So now I can freely take the knight on c3 and then go grab the pawn on e2 after that. And white is still okay here, but they would have to find the move rook h4. Bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3. And now black can force a draw if they want with queen d5 check. For instance, if like pawn e4, rook takes e4, and this will be a draw. We'll trade the rooks, and white's king is way too open. I think anything else other than rook h4 is potentially dangerous for white. Like, let's just say this is a terrible move, but let's say queen takes a6 is played. There's always tricks like queen f7. I don't even have to go for lines with bishop takes c3. Queen f7 is a nice double attack, hitting the rook and also threatening mate on f1. If something like, let's say queen b6, so trying to defend with queen g1, here I probably would take on c3 and then go after e2. And if white's rook is stuck around on h5, that's another good double attack, threatening the rook and threatening queen f1 or queen f3, probably more so queen f3. If rook f5, then queen e4 is another fork. So it just so happens in these lines that white's king turns out to be more vulnerable. And sometimes it's these little moves that will make the difference in your calculation. h6. These are the type of moves that make me continue playing chess. Because when you find a move like that over the board, even though this remained unseen, like this didn't happen in the game, but it was like the crux of my calculation, it made everything work. And I could tell he saw it too, because he started spending some time and he repeated the position after queen e6. So he did not take on b7. He just brought the queen back to c2, and this is the position we had a couple moves prior. He's attacking h7 again. I saw no reason not to repeat, and I don't have chances to win here, so I'm okay with a draw. Queen g6. I thought there was a chance he might trade queens and try to milk something from that rook endgame, but I'm going to be winning the pawn back, and it's just a easy technical task to draw. So after repeating one more time, move 30, queen c2, he offered a draw, and I accepted. So this is a relatively short game with a lot of theory behind it. You can see that we really didn't get to an original position until right about here on move 19, and then we only had 10, 11 moves on our own. But it's kind of neat to play chess like this, where there's a lot of theory backing the moves that you're playing, and you get to like key positions pretty soon after that theory ends. And in this case, I'm glad that I was able to make the right calls at the right time, especially in finding queen e6. Still not sure about this moment, like whether rook be8 is strictly what I should do, because again, queen takes a5 is the top choice of the computer. But from a human point of view, I very much like this move, and even though black is pretty much just playing for a draw after this, I think it's very tough for white to do anything, and there's also some traps, like if white overextends, they could even lose. So drew this game, and I'm on 3.5 out of 4 after this game. Hope you guys enjoyed the analysis for this one. Not too many non-chess updates to report on in London. We're on a 1 game a day schedule now for the rest of the tournament. This is kind of where you get into like the real groove of the tournament. So I'm going to bed fairly late, as is my custom. I do this even when I'm at home. And I'm sleeping till late morning and kind of getting up, and the game is not till 4:30 p.m. each day. So I'm trying not to get up like too early, because you want to have energy for the evening round. But I usually just go to a coffee shop in the morning. They got a Starbucks here. I'm happy. It's pretty close to my hotel. So I can just go over there and prepare for my game and drink some coffee and kind of just relax. I am staying a couple days after the tournament ends to watch the end of the actual London Classic. So we'll see what the top guys are doing and just sightsee a little bit in London too. All right, let me know if you have any questions on this game. As always, thank you for watching and thank you for the support. And I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye.